in Chapter 7, Fixed Exchange Rates and Foreign Exchange Intervention. And this chapter is very big, so I'm splitting it over 2 weeks. And it covers a lot of topics. It actually revisits most of the topics we already covered, but it revisits them with a different way of thinking. Because in Chapter 3, Chapter 4, Chapter 5, Chapter 6, we assumed that the exchange rate could fluctuate without any restraint, without any limits. So we learned about how changes in interest rates changed the exchange rate in Chapter 3. In Chapter 4, we learned that a change in the money supply would change interest rates, which would change exchange rates. In Chapter 5, we learned about how prices of goods and services could change in the long run and change exchange rates. And in Chapter 6, we learned about the general equilibrium of the economy, where changes in the asset market or the goods market would have an effect on the exchange rate and output. All of that is perfectly valid, but it always assumed that the exchange rate could in fact change. It could move permanently from one number to another. That ability to move is actually not something we should take for granted. It is not something that has been an inherent feature of the world. And what we're going to do in this chapter is to redo our theory, revise our theory, all the theory that we've studied up until now, to allow for the possibility that the exchange rate cannot change. And we're doing this because in a lot of the world in the past, and in some parts of the world today, such as Hong Kong, the exchange rate cannot change freely. And we need to know what are the consequences of that lack of freedom for an economy in an open macroeconomic setting. Now, when we talk about the exchange rate being unable to change, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the Hong Kong context of 1 USD equals exactly 7.8 Hong Kong dollars. One type of arrangement that we could call fixed would actually be a managed float, where maybe the central bank is not intervening every day in the foreign exchange market, but it is generally understood that if the exchange rate changes too much, then the central bank will intervene with the goal of returning the exchange rate to a particular number. In other cases, we may have a regional currency arrangement, such as the franc CFA, or we have a hard peg. Hong Kong is what we would call a hard peg to a single currency. Singapore is a hard peg to a basket of currencies, and by all accounts, mainland China, at least until recently, has been a hard peg to a basket of currencies. So, in the previous chapters, we talked generally about the central bank changing the money supply. To understand how central banks manage the particular type of fixed arrangement that they have, we need to talk a little more about central bank operations. And we're going to focus on the central bank balance sheet, which is the document listing the assets and liabilities of the central bank. And here is a very simple example of such a balance sheet. And as was the case with the balance of payments, we will describe this as a balance sheet that follows the principle of double entry bookkeeping. There are assets and liabilities. So a central bank's total assets equal its total net liabilities plus its net worth. So net worth would be something like the building that the central bank owns, the building where it houses its headquarters. For simplicity, we will assume net worth is 0. So there's no building. The central bank just exists somehow. This is not realistic, but having non-Nero's net worth is not going to be critical or not going to make the explanation any clearer or different. We're going to assume that we can divide assets into two types: foreign assets and domestic assets. So the central bank is the central bank of an economy, and a domestic asset in that economy is generally a government bond. Maybe the government sold the bond to the central bank, because the central bank is not necessarily government owned, and the government sold this bond to the central bank to get money from the central bank. Another type of asset that a central bank would have would be a loan that it makes to a private bank in the economy. So in most economies, private banks like HSBC in Hong Kong or Chongqing Bank, they must have accounts with the central bank or the organization that is like the central bank. And in Hong Kong, that would be the HKMA that issued this note. Foreign assets will be similar things, but not produced domestically. So foreign currency, foreign government bonds, gold. And just as an ordinary bank's liabilities includes its customers' deposits, a central bank's liabilities include deposits held by the economy's private banks. So in the United States, Citibank is a very famous bank. They will have an account with the Federal Reserve, and they must hold some reserves with the Federal Reserve. Those reserves are a deposit that Citibank makes to the Federal Reserve. The money is in possession of the Federal Reserve, but it belongs to Citibank, so Citibank's deposit at the Federal Reserve is a liability for the Federal Reserve and an asset for Citibank. Normally, the central bank is the organization that issues currency. So you can see here, we have the phrase Federal Reserve Note. So it is the Federal Reserve of the United States that issued this piece of paper. This does not say explicitly Hong Kong Monetary Authority, but it does say Government of Hong Kong. And here you have 中国人民银行, also in Roman letters here. So you can see that these notes are issued by the central bank. And when a central bank chooses to print pieces of paper and put them into circulation so people can buy and sell, we would say that the central bank is creating a liability. Why do we consider this a liability of the respective central banks? Because in the past, anyone who held one of these pieces of paper could go to the issuing bank and demand gold or silver in exchange for handing over the piece of paper. So this is how we organize things. Now, on any given day, the central bank may change its assets and liabilities. And we're going to see, I say assume, but we're going to demonstrate why we should assume that a change in a central bank asset automatically causes an equal change in a central bank's liabilities. As an example, suppose that a central bank buys an asset. Even if you are a central bank and you buy something, you have to pay for it. How can you pay for it? There are one of two ways. First, you hand out cash. And you're the central bank, so you can make cash easily if you want to, and if you have the legal right to do so. Well, if you hand out cash that was not in circulation before, so that you get an asset, then you are, by definition, increasing the number of liabilities. Because recall, this is a liability of the US Federal Reserve. This is a liability of the People's Bank of China. So if these central banks are buying an asset and paying for it by handing the seller of the asset this piece of paper, the central bank is putting more currency in circulation, which is to say liabilities, into the economy. Assets and liabilities move in equal way. Second way, to pay by check. Well, the recipient of the check will deposit it in her account at a private bank. The private bank now has a claim on the central bank, so the private bank that received this check, written by the central bank, now has more money because the check represents money leaving the central bank and going to the private bank. And when money flows away from an institution, from an organization, that is a liability. In either case, central banks' purchases of assets automatically cause an equal increase in liabilities. And if the example were selling an asset instead of buying it, things would work the exact same way. When the central bank buys an asset from the public, so there used to be an asset in the public, the central bank takes it up, its payment directly enters the money supply, and then the mirror image for selling. The increase in central bank liabilities associated with the asset purchase causes the money supply to expand. And again, if we were selling assets instead of buying them, you would just pay attention to all the verbs in parentheses. You may also want to recall the money multiplier effects that you should have learned in intermediate macroeconomics, or maybe you learned it in the money and banking class. Keep those things in mind. So everything I just talked about was purely domestic focused, and it could have been explained in a closed economy class or a closed economy money and banking class. But we are taking open macroeconomics. Recall that international finance and open macroeconomics mean almost the same thing to an economist. And therefore, we should consider the possibility that the central bank buys and sells foreign assets. So let's assume that the central bank has a foreign bond, and it sells it in the market, and it wants in payment the central bank's own currency, the equivalent of $100. So this bond leaves the central bank, and recall the bond is an asset for the bank. The central bank takes $100 from the market, $100 of its own currency that it created, and is therefore liability. So removing this $100 from the market reduces the liabilities. So, as the book says, this will reduce official holdings of foreign assets from 1,000 to 900, causing the asset side of the central bank balance sheet to shrink from 2,500 to 2,400. So here you see I have revised the table from earlier in accordance with this slide, and as such, assets and liabilities both fall. The money supply declines because the bank took its own currency out of circulation. Now, let's say that the central bank has very good reasons to sell this foreign bond, but it does not want to change the domestic money supply, because you will recall from Chapter 4, when the bank changes the domestic money supply, the interest rate changes, the exchange rate changes, eventually the price will change if this is permanent, the price level will change, and the central bank might not want to do that. What can the central bank do? It can sterilize the foreign exchange intervention. And sterilize, in this case, in finance, will often mean changing assets and liabilities of different types. In some contexts, it can be buying short-term bonds from the market, but then selling long-term bonds. In this case, the division, the distinction, the partition is not short versus long, it's foreign versus domestic. So after selling the foreign asset and receiving domestic currency, so at the end of this comma, the money supply goes down, the central bank can turn around and buy a domestic asset and issue domestic currency. So issuing pushes the money supply up, it undoes pushing the money supply down. So here we again return to a situation where total assets equals total liabilities 2,500, but the composition has changed. There can be many reasons why a central bank might do this. One of those is because the central bank will look at the official settlements balance and realize that the official settlements balance in the balance of payments is too big. And when you have a big official settlements balance, it means that the buying and selling of all goods, services, and assets by private individuals, private businesses in the economy, is very imbalanced and will lead to sharp changes in the exchange rate that the central bank might not like. We can think of the official settlements balance as the international payments gap that central banks must finance through their reserve transactions. Any imbalance at the overall level of the balance of payments will be called a deficit, even if it refers to a current account surplus. Because if you have a large current account surplus, you have a financial account deficit. So this convention makes sense. If we have a home balance of payments deficit, it means countries' net foreign reserve liabilities are increasing. That is to say, some combination of reserve sales by the home central bank and reserve purchases by foreign central banks is covering a home deficit on the current and capital account, not fully matched by net private sales of assets to foreigners. So, for example, let's take the United States. We know that the United States buys more goods and services from the rest of the world than does it sell to the rest of the world. So the US has had a current account deficit every year since 1991. And even before 1991, it had current account deficits for a long time. Imagine, for the moment, that non-Americans did not want to buy government bonds, US stocks, US companies with all the dollars that Americans supplied to the foreign exchange market when Americans were demanding foreign currency to buy foreign goods and services. If all the dollars in the world were not used by foreign governments or foreign private parties to buy up the assets made by the US, the government bonds, the stocks, the US companies, then the US dollar definitely would lose value. And furthermore, if the Federal Reserve did not like this, then the Federal Reserve would see that the US has created these assets for others, which are liabilities from the perspective of the United States, and the Federal Reserve might decide to buy up all of these bonds created by the US government because private sales of those bonds to foreigners were too little to absorb the supply. That is to say, the home economy, the United States, bought more than did it sell overseas, but foreigners are not demanding enough of the assets from the home economy. And in the example that I just gave you, the home economy was the United States. A home balance of payments deficit can also be a home surplus that falls short of net private purchases of financial claims on foreigners. That is to say, homes businesses sold a lot of goods and services overseas, but they are the home businesses with the foreign currency aren't buying up assets made in the foreign economies, and so they bring their foreign currency back home and convert it to domestic currency. This would be the case of China, where Chinese companies sell lots of goods and services overseas. They earn euros, they earn dollars, they earn yen, they earn pounds. Maybe Chinese people and businesses want to buy some non-Chinese goods and services, but they don't buy many. And what is the Chinese economy going to do with all this excess non-Chinese currency? It gets put into Chinese banks, converted to renminbi. The depositor of the foreign currency converts it to renminbi. The bank where they got the renminbi now has the euros, the pounds, the dollars. That's the Chinese bank. These foreign currencies eventually become the possession of the People's Bank of China, and the People's Bank of China knows that if it does nothing, the value of the renminbi will go up. Chinese exports become more expensive outside China. Maybe the People's Bank of China doesn't want the renminbi to gain value. So the People's Bank of China, the State Administration for Foreign Exchange, take the excess foreign currency and uses it to buy non-Chinese assets. Otherwise, there would be massive changes in the domestic money supply. And indeed, when the People's Bank of China gets all these assets, that potentially could lead to an increase in the money supply. If central banks are not sterilizing and the home country has a balance of payments surplus, then any associated increase in the home central bank's foreign assets implies an increase in the home money supply. Because remember, assets and liabilities move together. If assets on the balance sheet of a central bank go up, so do liabilities, currency in circulation. Any associated decrease in a foreign central bank's claims on the home country implies a decreased foreign money supply. The extent to which a central bank chooses to sterilize these interventions will influence the growth in the money supply. So this is why sterilization is important. Because when an economy is interacting with the rest of the world, foreign assets will move into the economy, and they may work their way onto the asset side of the central bank. All else held equal, more assets in the central bank, whether they are domestic or foreign, will give rise to more liabilities for the central bank, which means more currency in circulation. The central bank can keep the money supply constant if it chooses sterilized intervention, meaning if the central bank is buying up foreign assets, so if the People's Bank of China is buying up assets in pounds, dollars, euros, yen, it's putting renminbi into the market, but then the People's Bank of China can sell domestic assets that it holds into the Chinese economy and take away the extra renminbi that it put in because of the purchase of the non-Chinese assets. All right, so in this section I want to explain how the central bank actually fixes the exchange rate. And recall that the exchange rate is a price. It is the price of foreign currency in terms of domestic currency. So when a price is fixed, it means that both buyers and sellers must abide by this price. And since it is the central bank that issues the currency, that issues the domestic currency that is setting this price, effectively the central bank is committing to buy and sell its own currency at this fixed price no matter what. So the mainland has had a fixed exchange rate against the US dollar in the past. You can see here the data. Hong Kong has had a fixed exchange rate against the US dollar even longer. And in both cases, the relevant authority commits itself to buying and selling its own currency in any quantity. In practice, the central bank will find that buying its own currency is harder to do than selling its own currency. Because when you buy something, you have to pay for it. If Hong Kong has a fixed exchange rate and it commits to always buy Hong Kong dollars at 7.8 Hong Kong dollars per one US dollar, what ultimately is it using as payment to buy its own currency? It's paying out US dollars. Can the Hong Kong Monetary Authority create US dollars? No. Can the Hong Kong Monetary Authority create Hong Kong dollars? In principle, yes. So, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority will have a harder time selling US dollars, which means buying Hong Kong dollars, than buying US dollars, which means selling Hong Kong dollars. The central bank can succeed in holding this rate fixed only if it has the credibility and the strength to intervene in asset markets to ensure that the exchange rate remains at its fixed level when there is buying and selling. And to demonstrate how this happens, we need to go back to what we learned in Chapter 3 and talk about the pricing formula for foreign exchange. Recall uncovered interest rate parity, where we have the domestic interest rate, the foreign interest rate. We have the spot price of foreign currency today. We have today's expectations of the future spot price. For the fixed exchange rate to work and to be credible, what is the relationship that we need between the expected rate and the actual rate? That is to say, if Hong Kong wants to maintain a credible peg of 7.8 Hong Kong dollars for every one US dollar, what must that mean about the market's expectations of the future value of the US dollar in terms of Hong Kong dollar, or the future value of the Hong Kong dollar in terms of the US dollar? Once you answer that question in the fourth bullet, what does that imply about the relationship between R and R star? Well, to ensure equilibrium in the foreign exchange market, we're going to have identical interest rates. And we must have identical interest rates because E and expected E have to be the same. Because how can you have a fixed exchange rate if the spot price today is 3, but you allow the market to believe that tomorrow's spot price will be 4? It doesn't make sense. So E must equal expected E. You can divide those out. Then you get 1 equals 1 over R minus R star plus. The only way that can hold mathematically is for R to equal R star. And since the domestic interest rate in an economy, even in an economy with a fixed exchange rate, is determined by the interaction of demand and supply, we then have to take this conclusion that a fixed exchange rate requires equal interest rates and go to the domestic money market. So to hold the domestic interest rate at R star, and R star is the foreign interest rate, so the domestic monetary authority, the domestic central bank, if it wants a fixed exchange rate, it decides we will fix against some other economy some foreign economy, we will choose for our own economy the interest rate chosen by that foreign economy. And this domestic central bank will have to adjust its own money supply so that the equilibrium interest rate in its own economy, in the domestic economy, not only equals R star, but also equates domestic real money demand with the domestic real money supply. So here you have the equilibrium condition for the domestic money market, where we are targeting R star, the interest rate chosen by the foreign exchange rate, by the foreign central bank, and then mimicked or imitated, copied by the domestic central bank. Now, let me talk a little more about this equilibrium condition, because it involves other variables, M, P, and Y. P and Y are largely outside of the central bank's control. The central bank, because they chose to have a fixed exchange rate, chose their interest rate to equal R star. That leaves them with one variable left, that is the money supply. Therefore, the theory of fixed exchange rates, the basic theory of fixed exchange rates, says that the central bank must automatically adjust domestic money supply so that the money market equilibrium is maintained with R equals R star. So now that we know what it means to have a fixed exchange rate, it means you copy the interest rate of another economy, you adjust your own money supply to guarantee that the equilibrium interest rate in your economy is exactly equal to the interest rate in the economy against which you're pegging, to whom you're pegging. Now we're going to revisit Chapter 6 to see what are the consequences of this decision of a fixed exchange rate on fiscal policy and monetary policy. Previously in Chapter 6, we assumed a flexible exchange rate. Now we are going to redo the essence of Chapter 6, but with a fixed exchange rate. Now, let's start with monetary policy. A recent slide, slide 21 actually, said that the central bank must automatically adjust the domestic money supply so that the money market equilibrium is maintained with R equals R star. So, if the central bank commits using the money supply to preserve a fixed interest rate, is there any scope for a central bank to change its money supply for other purposes, like stimulating demand? Is there scope? The answer is no. By fixing an exchange rate, the central bank loses its stability to use monetary policy for the purpose of macroeconomic stabilization. And a very nice recognition of this in the real world comes from Goh Keng Swee, who was chairman of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, who gave this famous speech, which is memorialized in a museum run by the Monetary Authority of Singapore. I visited it. And Dr. Swee, or Dr. Goh, says, in Singapore, which of the monetary aggregates does the MAS watch? M1, M2, or M3? I hope you remember from this class which one of these M's we're talking about. The answer is none. The MAS is probably the only central bank that does not have to watch the M's, the different money supplies. What then does it watch? It watches the foreign exchange rates. And this is a very distinct feature of Singapore, that they use as their target for monetary policy not the money supply, not the domestic interest rate, but the exchange rate, the value of the Singapore dollar against a basket of other currencies. China, the mainland, from 1994 to 2005, even if they never said it out loud, the goal of all of their monetary policy was to preserve 8.28 renminbi per dollar. And anything that the People's Bank of China did had as its goal preservation of 8.28 renminbi per dollar. So the takeaway message is that for simple fixed exchange rate theory, monetary policy is not available for helping your economy. All monetary policy must be directed towards preserving the fixed exchange rate. That leaves us only with fiscal policy. And you could see that a fiscal expansion led to a stronger domestic currency and greater output. Now, when the government undertakes fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate, an appreciating currency is not allowed. What must a central bank do when it sees appreciating pressure on its own currency? Well, the central bank has to ensure the exchange rate remains at E1 and cannot stay at E2. Going from E1 to E2 means appreciation of the domestic currency. So the central bank has to undo this appreciation, effectively depreciate the currency, go against the market forces that push up the value of the currency. How can the central bank create a weakening force on its currency to counteract the strengthening force caused by the fiscal policy? Well, the central bank has to expand the money supply, because initially there is excess demand for money because the rise in output raises demand for money. We know that from chapter 4, because the demand function, the liquidity function L, has output in it. So to prevent the excess money demand from pushing up the interest rate and appreciating E, the central bank must buy up foreign assets, because if you buy something that you didn't buy before, you raise its price. And it must be paying for this, which is to say selling its own currency, increasing the money supply. Because when you increase the supply of something, its price goes down. Basic microeconomics. This is going to be expansionary monetary policy. This expansionary monetary policy comes after the expansionary fiscal policy, and therefore the growth in output is much bigger than what would have happened under a floating exchange rate. So fiscal policy becomes very powerful in a fixed exchange rate economy. It's powerful to expand output, but be careful, it is equally powerful at contracting output. This is what a central bank must do if it wants to maintain an exchange rate at E0. But even under a fixed exchange rate, economies can decide, and have decided, that they want to have a fixed exchange rate, but fixed at a different value, fixed at a different number for E. In the event where the economy decides to make its currency permanently weaker, we would say that is a devaluation. In the event that the central bank wants to make its currency permanently stronger, we would say a revaluation. Now note that these terms refer to actions undertaken by a government institution with the express goal of changing the exchange rate. These terms are related to, but different from appreciation to depreciation, because we use appreciation and depreciation to refer to actions, to refer to the result of a change in the price of currency undertaken by individual decentralized traders, traders who don't have a goal in their mind to make the currency have a different value. Now, these traders may be changing their actions because the government does something, but even if a trader reacts in response to a change in government policy, we are unlikely. We almost never would use devaluation, revaluation for the subsequent changes in the exchange rate. We use revaluation, devaluation when the central bank intervenes to change the value of its currency. Why would a government do this? Why did China in 2005 decide to stop pegging the renminbi against the dollar and instead let the renminbi appreciate gradually? Well, let's talk about devaluation as a specific example, because in history, the devaluation is the type of change that has happened most often by central banks and has grabbed the most attention. Some economies, such as West Germany, did revalue in the 60s, and I believe Switzerland as well, in recent memory, has done something like a revaluation. But anyway, let's talk about devaluation. Well, we know that if an economy has high unemployment, weak economic growth, we know eventually prices of goods and services should adjust to return the economy to full employment. But this may take too long, and a government might decide that devaluing its currency to encourage exports to stimulate GDP could be a good thing. And that might be a good option if the government is not in a position to go into debt, to spend more than it has in tax revenue. Related to what I just said, a government might think its economy is mostly okay, but the economy may see its current account and think that there's a deficit, think that this current account deficit is too big, and the central bank, the government, may want to narrow this deficit. And related to that, the central bank itself may be running low on reserves. So if I am, let's say, a small economy like Malaysia, and maybe I don't have enough dollars or enough renminbi in my central bank to back up all these Malaysian ringgit, I want to make the value of my reserves go up. How can I do that? Well, if I devalue, then suddenly, if I devalue my Malaysian ringgit when I'm the central bank of Malaysia, the remaining dollars and renminbi that I have in my reserves are all worth more in terms of more ringgit. And let's say I, the central bank, strongly believe that by weakening my ringgit, my domestic currency, I can encourage the US and China to buy more of my goods and services, which will bring in a supply of dollars and renminbi. That might help boost the reserves I have in my central bank of Malaysia, Bank Negara Malaysia. So I may think this if I'm a central banker, but I in the central bank have to be cautious, because if I order a devaluation, I don't know very clearly if this one devaluation, supposedly one time, will make ordinary people in the economy, in the market, start to expect another devaluation later. When we have adjustments to fiscal policy and exchange rate changes, talking about the stabilization policy, let's take as an example a fiscal expansion. And we're going to assume that we start from full employment. So this assumption of starting from full employment may not be consistent with the situation here, but it could be consistent with an economy that has a large current account deficit or is suddenly low on reserves. Ultimately, we, in the long run, expect the prices of goods and services to adjust after fiscal and exchange rate changes to restore full employment. So you have fiscal expansion, it increases output. Eventually that's going to increase the price level because you have greater economic activity. And as the price level rises, home output becomes more expensive, so aggregate demand will fall back to sustainable levels and return the level of output to the initial full employment level. And once the economy is operating its resources at the full employment level, there is no more pressure on the price level. And that means we have a real appreciation. We have a real appreciation because whether E is floating or fixed, the fiscal expansion gives rise to upward pressure on the exchange rate. We know that with greater Y, greater output, MAER says an appreciation. If we don't let the currency appreciate because we have a fixed rate, then the effect of the fiscal expansion gets doubled. That leads to a lot more economic growth. Recall that under a fixed exchange rate, the fiscal expansion necessitates an increase in the money supply to counteract the appreciation. When you have greater money supply, eventually the price level will increase. This is different from under a floating regime, because under a floating regime, there is no change in the price level after a fiscal expansion because the money supply remains unchanged. In this textbook, in these theories, the price level should change only if the money supply changes. Here, the money supply is not changing under the floating rate, so the price level won't change. All right, now recall in the previous video that I mentioned one reason a central bank in an economy with a fixed currency might decide to devalue was that the central bank might realize, if it's, let's say, Malaysia, that it has too few US dollars or renminbi or other hard currencies, and that it hopes that by devaluing, it can boost exports, bring in more units of hard currency, and support its own currency in circulation. And I noted that the central bank may not know very clearly if allowing this devaluation makes or does not make everyone else in the market expect another one with higher probability. And the central bank doesn't know this because the central bank cannot successfully second-guess market participants. And the phrase second guess means, I guess what you guess. As market participants know that the central bank may respond to such situations by devaluing the currency, it would be unreasonable to expect that market participants will expect the current exchange rate to be maintained forever. So this is where international finance, open macroeconomics, becomes kind of psychological. And formalizing this mathematically can become very messy and very abstract. That's only if you go for further study. In this class, we will contain our analysis to graphs. If the market believes that a now fixed currency will suddenly lose value, this could give rise to a balance of payments crisis. Because if this currency is going to get devalued, it means one unit will buy fewer units of hard currency. And normally, all else held equal, people prefer to store their wealth in hard currency than other not hard currency. So the fear would be that if people believe, if they change their beliefs, if they change their expectations to anticipate a devaluation, then ordinary traders in the market start putting downward pressure on the domestic currency. And downward pressure means a higher value of E. That would undermine the central bank, and the central bank would have to raise interest rates, which is to say, decrease the money supply to attract capital back into the economy. This could happen because, for example, if the trade deficit widens, gets worse and worse, a bit like Turkey, people in Turkey who have their wealth in Turkish lira see that the current account deficit is getting bigger. They know that a big current account deficit means that a lot of money is leaving Turkey. These Turkish people may think that the government cannot sell enough assets to get a surplus on the financial account to balance things out. And if people in Turkey or any other smaller economy act as if the domestic currency is already weak, then it's reasonable to expect that they will store their wealth in a different currency. They will sell their wealth currently in their domestic currency. They sell the domestic currency, and they put their wealth in a harder foreign currency. Unless the government does something, unless the central bank does something like decrease the money supply to raise interest rates, the forex market will leave equilibrium. It would move away from 1 prime to somewhere up here. That would put downward pressure on the domestic currency. If the central bank accepts that market expectations have changed and now are pricing in a worsening of the currency, a depreciation, a weaker value for the currency, but the central bank doesn't want to change the official value of the currency, then the central bank must target a higher interest rate. And as I said previously, as you can see here, higher interest rate means slower money supply. And think about what will happen in the long run when the money supply is lower. The book phrases this very nicely. The expectation of a future devaluation causes a balance of payments crisis marked by a sharp fall in reserves and a rise in the home interest rate above the world interest rate. Similar for revaluation, but normally we don't worry about revaluations. They can happen, they can be problematic, they can be troublesome, but they are rare. Certainly, fears of a future devaluation will mean that people store their wealth in foreign currency. They may also start buying foreign goods and services in larger numbers. Because if I am Malaysian, maybe I import many products from the US or China. If the Malaysian ringgit suddenly will be worth less because of depreciation, or a devaluation, I should say, the Malaysian price of American products and Chinese products, the price of these products in this currency will go up. And that will be hard for me. So maybe I start buying more non-Malaysian products immediately because I am certain there will be a devaluation. If the economy increases its imports, then that makes the current account deficit even bigger. And that brings about the crisis that officials were worrying about. All in all, when people believe that the currency will lose value, when a currency will be devalued, there is something that we call capital flight. residents flee the domestic currency by selling it to the central bank for foreign exchange, either to store their wealth in that foreign exchange or to buy goods and services from abroad, from the foreign economy, that the domestic residents value and want to purchase before they become too expensive. And when fears of devaluation arise because reserves are low in the first place, maybe because there already was a current account deficit, capital flight is of particular concern to the government. This crisis may actually emerge because of profligate government spending. Think back to Chapter 2 when I gave you the decomposition of the current account into mismatch between private saving, private investment, and mismatch between government spending and government revenue. If the government is spending too much money and is borrowing a lot, the central bank may feel obliged, may feel compelled to buy bonds from the government, to print money effectively for the purpose of buying up these bonds and giving the government currency with which it can engage in purchases. Now, the book at this point says something that may contradict what we learned in Chapter 6, at least if you're not thinking carefully. If the central bank demands more money to spend on G, then the central bank must buy government bonds and supply currency. As the domestic money supply is higher, there is a tendency for the domestic currency to depreciate. That is the opposite of what we saw in Chapter 6 via MAER for fiscal expansion. If that happens, how can the economy fight the depreciating pressure on the domestic currency? Well, when a currency depreciates, it loses value. And when a domestic currency depreciates, foreign currencies appreciate. The price of the foreign currency goes up. If you don't like the price going up, you have to sell it, because when you increase supply of something, its price falls. And you sell off the foreign currency, you buy the domestic currency. You buy the domestic currency with the foreign currency. That means you start to lose your foreign exchange reserves, and the central bank at some point may realize it does not have enough hard currency to support the exchange rate. And as the possibility of a collapse rises over time, the interest rate must also rise, because a higher interest rate, all else equal, attracts capital. And this continues until the interest rate is so high that the Forex market is restored to the equilibrium preferred by the central bank, or the central bank runs out of foreign reserves and gives up the fixed exchange rate. This last bullet notes that the interest rate increases because of changing perceptions by outsiders of risk to the domestic economy. We will revisit this point later in a formal sense. But related to changing perceptions, I want to give you a summary of how a currency crisis, a balance of payment crisis, can happen, not because of poor fiscal policy, but because of other factors. So let's suppose we have an economy in which the domestic bank's liabilities are short-term deposits, and the assets are loans to businesses, loans that will go unpaid if there's a recession, because the business will go bankrupt. The business will not have enough revenue. Speculators may be aware of this situation for commercial banks. And if speculators learn of this situation, they may conclude that these banks are very vulnerable. And if the banks suffer, the central bank will have to bail them out. The central bank may run out of hard currency, and that will increase the likelihood of a devaluation. Speculators may therefore conclude there will be a devaluation. They will start to take their money out already. The interest rate has to go up. That raises the borrowing costs for banks. It raises the borrowing cost for everyone. And it causes a recession and reduces the value of bank assets because the probability of default on these loans goes up. To prevent domestic banks from going out of business, the central bank has to extend credit to these banks. And again, that's going to make fewer foreign reserves available for propping up the currency. It's going to use up foreign reserves, and it will reduce the ability of the central bank to maintain the fixed exchange rate. That raises the probability of devaluation, and it actually starts the economic crisis and brings about an actual devaluation. All right, so we've learned so far the traditional, basic, almost, as I will explain why, simple theory of fixed exchange rates. And that theory describes how Hong Kong operates with respect to its currency and how the mainland has operated from 1994 to 2005. But it does not describe accurately all economies that we would consider to have exchange rate regimes that aren't free-floating. There are instead many regimes that would have a managed float. And under a managed float, monetary policy is influenced by exchange rate changes. So certainly the value of the currency is something that the central bank will consider on a regular basis. There may be instances where the central bank will undertake monetary policy whose primary goal is to achieve a certain result in the foreign exchange market. But there may be other instances where the central bank will target a different goal for its monetary policy and will accept whatever consequences may be for the foreign exchange rate. That is to say, there is a trade-off. Today, we take almost as a given that the objective of a central bank should be the maintenance of domestic economic conditions, such as stable inflation of, let's say, 2%. That's sort of the magic number. Or full employment rate between 5 and 6%. What we're going to find in this section is that under this naive way of thinking, this sort of very basic way of understanding fixed exchange rates, if we have a strict fixed exchange rate, then sterilization is not going to be possible. I think we mentioned or alluded to that earlier. But then we're going to learn that if we have a more realistic view of the world, we can see that an economy can have a fixed exchange rate and yet give a little room for independent, domestically focused monetary policy. So when a central bank carries out a sterilized foreign exchange intervention, by definition, the money supply will be unchanged. That's the whole definition of what it means to be sterilized. And in most cases, in many cases, we think sterilization can be good because if the money supply is unchanged, the price level should not change, therefore inflation will not be any different. The problem for an economy that wants to fix its exchange rate is that if the exchange rate is moving to an extent that the central bank dislikes, then the central bank has to achieve a different interest rate to realign its currency with the foreign currency. And the only way the central bank can do this is to change the money supply. So under this way of thinking, sterilization is not feasible. As the book says, it will be fruitless. and we learned about this in the context of fiscal expansion. Now, the book on this point wrote to hold the exchange rate constant when fiscal policy becomes expansive, the central bank must buy foreign assets and should expand the money supply, because this will weaken the currency, and that counteracts the strengthening of the currency in the third bullet. Now, as a small point, I'm not so sure that buying foreign assets is absolutely necessary to expand the money supply. That is to say, I don't think the assets have to be foreign. In principle, I think the assets could be domestic, because the goal here is to increase the money supply. And you can increase the money supply by buying any asset if you are a central bank. I suspect that the book wants to emphasize that in buying foreign assets, the domestic central bank contributes to weakening its currency. The central bank is effectively devaluing. In any case, the long-run implication for the domestic economy when you have a higher money supply, well, we learned that in Chapter 4. Greater money supply, greater price level. Milton Friedman, the late economist from the University of Chicago, who had that TV show and won the Nobel Prize, said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, because he was a monetarist. And even though a lot of his philosophy is no longer accepted by mainstream economists, this piece of philosophy is important in this book. So, the central bank may want to avoid inflation by sterilizing the increase in the money supply, but the whole reason the central bank increased the money supply was to preserve the fixed exchange rate. And if you try to sterilize an increase in the money supply, you have to reduce the money supply, the interest rate goes back up, the central bank has to buy more assets to keep exchange rate fixed, and the central bank would just go back and forth and never understand or accept that in this way of thinking, it can have a sterilized intervention or it can have a fixed exchange rate. It cannot have both. And when I said this way of thinking, I meant perfect asset substitutability. An implicit assumption that buying or selling a domestic bond has the same effect as does buying and selling a foreign bond. We made this substitutability, we assumed perfect substitutability when we developed UIRP, because we assumed the risk profiles on the domestic bond and the foreign bond were the same. And under the assumption of perfect substitutability, there is nothing that a central bank can do through foreign exchange intervention that it could not do as well through purely domestic open market operations. Now, the assumption of perfect asset substitutability, this is a little strict. This is a little strong. Strong means you need a strong effort, a strong argument in your mind to accept that it's true. A weaker, more realistic assumption is that maybe the risk on a Japanese bond and the risk on an Australian bond or Brazilian bond or Argentine bond are quite different. And therefore these assets are not perfect substitutes, they are imperfect substitutes. And therefore the true return to capital in these different assets could be quite different from what simple, naive UIRP would imply. And therefore, an agent may hold an asset from Argentina or Brazil if and only if the expected return is quite high, in excess of the return to owning capital in that economy. This is what I meant back on slide 39 when I spoke about the last bullet implying that the interest rate increases because of changing perceptions by outsiders of risk to the domestic economy. I said at the time that we would return to this point later. Now we have returned to it. Under perfect asset substitutability, participants in the Forex market care only about expected rates of return. And as these rates are determined by monetary policy, actions such as a sterilized intervention that do not affect the money supply also don't affect the exchange rate. But under imperfect asset substitutability, both risk and return matter. So central bank actions that alter the riskiness of domestic currency assets can move the exchange rate even if the money supply does not change. Even if the equilibrium interest rate in the domestic market, the return on owning capital in the domestic market, does not change. So recall, under perfect asset substitutability, the domestic rate of return on domestic assets, R, equals the domestic rate of return on foreign assets. I mean the return on foreign assets measured in domestic currency this way. But if assets are imperfect substitutes, we get equality between domestic rate of return measured in domestic currency and foreign rate of return measured in domestic currency only with the help of a risk premium, and we will call that risk premium rho. What determines rho? Well, many things could determine rho. For the purpose of this chapter, we are going to consider one, and only one thing. That is the stock of government debt available to the public. We are going to assume that the risk premium on domestic assets rises when the stock of government bonds available to be held by the public rises, and when the central bank's domestic assets, and falls when the central bank's domestic holdings, the holdings of the government bonds, rise. Effectively, what we are capturing here is the fact that when governments are irresponsible, they borrow a lot of money to increase G or cut T. How do they borrow money? They issue bonds. If there are a lot of bonds in the public may be nervous about the reliability of this government and of its currency. But if the bonds disappear because the central bank buys them, then the public may be calmer. They may think, oh, these bonds are a little scarce, so the price is likely to be high, interest rate is low. Or the public may think, since we, the public, see that the central bank has confidence in the government and its bonds, we, the public, will also have confidence in these bonds and in the currency. This is the way of thinking that we're going to adopt here. So an increased stock of domestic government debt will raise the difference between the expected returns on domestic and foreign currency bonds, all else held equal. But if the central bank buys up those assets, then the market doesn't have to worry that the government is going to run out of money. And therefore, because the central bank buys up these bonds and makes them disappear, in English we say out of sight, out of mind, therefore we think that the risk premium would fall. So the risk premium, we will represent it as an increasing function of the total stock of government debt, B, less the holdings in the central bank of these debt, A. So if B minus A is a big number, there is a lot of debt in the market and people feel nervous. The currency will be seen as risky. But if B minus A is small, then there is not a lot of debt available and the risk premium is quite low because people conclude that the government is not going to run out of money. We're going to see that under these assumptions, the bank can change the exchange rate through a sterilized foreign exchange intervention. This second bullet is one of the two things that this way of thinking, that this type of theory, imperfect asset substitutability, allows us to conclude. Under perfect asset substitutability, this second bullet is definitely false. But under a different set of beliefs, a different set of assumptions, the second bullet is true. Now, let's revisit the central bank's intervention under the possibility of imperfect asset substitutability. Recall that one of the goals of this investigation was to show, and you can find the quotation of this in the book, that the central bank can use sterilized intervention to hold E fixed as it varies the money supply to achieve domestic objectives such as full employment. In short, the exchange rate and the monetary policy can be managed independently. However, the graph that the book has produced to illustrate this process shows something quite different. It shows something consistent but quite different. It shows that an economy can keep the money supply stable in the short run, but target a different fixed exchange rate through sterilized purchases in the foreign exchange market. That is to say, let's assume the central bank wants to devalue its currency, but maintain a fixed money supply, fixed interest rates in the short run. So the central bank buys foreign assets, it devalues its own currency, because it's now demanding something else, and it's supplying extra domestic currency in the market. So greater demand for foreign pushes up the price, greater supply of domestic pushes down the price. By matching its purchase of foreign assets with a sale of domestic assets, the central bank holds the money supply constant. So you can see the money supply here hasn't moved. But because there are more domestic assets in the market, this currency, the domestic currency, now appears riskier. That is the implication of our assumption about the risk premium. And therefore, this greater risk leads to a weaker currency. As I say here, buying the foreign assets increases the stock of domestic currency in circulation. All else equal, that would increase the money supply. The bank then turns around and sterilizes its foreign asset purchase by selling domestic assets to take up the money that went into circulation. Zero net change in the money supply, but the domestic currency is weaker. As the book says, this pushes rho upward and shifts to the right the return on foreign currency deposits. Now, let's suppose instead that we want to show how the assumption of imperfect asset substitutability allows us to conclude that the central bank can use sterilized intervention to have a fixed E and vary the money supply. Okay. Suppose that an economy with a fixed exchange rate, quoted as domestic per foreign, wishes to increase its money supply in order to help its economy in the short run. So let's say that this economy is Hong Kong. It can buy more foreign assets, like US government bonds. It can buy them from the market, and it can put more money in the market. The HKMA can pay for these foreign assets in principle with more Hong Kong dollars. All else equal, what type of pressure will this put on the value of the Hong Kong dollar? Well, there's more supply of Hong Kong dollar, so all else equal, it would put downward pressure. So if it's putting downward pressure on the value of the Hong Kong dollar, and let's say that Hong Kong is the domestic economy, the US is the foreign economy, then that's going to make E want to go up. To reverse this pressure, in which direction must rho go? So we know that action 2 tended to make E go up. And if the left-hand side is going up, the right-hand side is going up. So we need to do something to make the right-hand side go down, so the left-hand side goes down. And our target is going to be rho, and the bonds inside it. So we want the right-hand side to go down. So if the right-hand side, if we want it to go down, we want it to be a smaller number, the denominator should therefore become bigger or smaller. We want the exchange rate to go down in bullet 4 because E started to go up in bullet 2. We need the denominator to get bigger. And if we need the denominator to get bigger, we need rho to get smaller, because rho has a minus sign, so you don't want to take away a lot from the rest of the terms. And if we want rho to get smaller, we want B minus A to get smaller. B is the total stock of bonds issued by the government. A is the central bank's holdings. We want rho to get smaller, so we want B minus A to get smaller, so we want A to get bigger. That would mean the HKMA would have to buy more bonds from the government. And if HKMA is buying more bonds from the government, overall, how is the money supply changing? The money supply is going up quite a bit. We had an increase in the 4th bullet point and also in the 2nd bullet point. So this seems to be a very reasonable way to think about risk premium, and almost nobody will say that a risk premium does not exist. That is to say, everyone will agree a risk premium does exist, but researchers have found little evidence that this sterilized intervention is especially helpful in separating the exchange rate movements from, let's say, fiscal and monetary policies. We assumed that expectations were not changing, but the very act of sterilizing or even announcing a sterilization could change the exchange rate. It could create a signaling effect. What does that mean? Well, suppose that the government is unhappy with the nominal rate and announces a decision to change some variable, and announces that they will be sterilizing the operation to keep the money supply fixed. That could, in principle, convince the market that the central bank wants to execute a home currency depreciation, because the central bank would be losing money if an appreciation occurred instead. The goal of that announcement is just to change the exchange rate without doing anything concrete. But if a government announces something that it's intending to do a certain action, but never follows through, eventually the market will catch on, and then these announcements will have no effect on the foreign exchange market. So I hope that helped. If you have questions, please let me know.